Welcome back to the Hero Report. My name is Ari Cohen from the University of Nebraska. With me, as always, my friend Matt Langdon from the Hero Construction Company. Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks, Ari.
It's a two-man podcast today. We're gonna stay away from a guest because we have some unfinished business from our first podcast that I thought we could talk about, and we'll be back next week with another guest. But I did want to revisit a topic that we hit on for just 2 or 3 seconds, really, in our first ever podcast that people, of course, can go back and see if they missed it. And that, of course, was this question of how important it is to be successful when we're thinking about whether or not someone is worthy of the hero designation. And you mentioned, I think, that success played an important role in your way of thinking about heroism, and since it was a video podcast and we were just figuring this thing out, I raised an eyebrow, which probably didn't translate very well to the people who were listening to the podcast, but I thought that would be an interesting thing that we could talk about for a few minutes, and I wonder if you could expand a little bit on what you meant when you said that success was an important component of heroism.
Yeah, definitely. It came up in my thinking a couple of years ago, I think, when there was a story about, I think it was someone in the Philippines who had rescued some people from drowning and in some pretty massive floods. And he had continued to basically swim to rescue people and swam himself to death through exhaustion is the general thought. And so I had just posted a link to the story and commented on it, as I tend to do, just saying, here's another example of someone who did something that didn't need to be done for others. And someone called me out on that and said, I think that there's a problem here in that this guy made the wrong decision, that he could have helped people, he could have gone away to get a boat, he could have taken a break, if he had taken a 10-minute break, he would have been able to save more people, and that ultimately his death made him more of a fool than it did a hero, because now his family was dealing with his death, that he had affected a whole lot of other people that were close to him in failing to do, in ultimately failing. He certainly saved some people, but he could have done better, I guess. So, honestly, I think I disagreed with this commenter at the time, but I had since talking to Zeno Franco, he had brought that concept up, and it made me bring that, or it brought that small conversation back. And ultimately, I think that is a big concern, that if you die in trying to do something heroic, there's a balance factor there. So you've died and you've left something. You've had an effect, a negative effect on your loved ones, the people close to you, whatever it might be. So that's the first bit, and I can expand a bit after your response.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. I of course totally disagree with the person who said, well, this was foolhardy. The potential rescuer should have taken a break, and so on. I mean, this is of course it's Monday morning quarterbacking, right? That's to say, if I had been in this situation, oh man, I would have just saved 5 people, then I would have had a picnic lunch, and then I would have gone back in and saved another 10 people. And having taken that break, I would have been so much more heroic. But this person was a fool because he didn't take the break, and he died then in trying to help others. For me, the thing that matters is the trying to help others. Right? we can't know whether we'll be successful or whether we'll fail. But what we want to do is make that effort. And I think if we were thinking a whole lot about whether we were going to be particularly successful, we might conclude that it's best not to even try. And as we know, I mean, the person who failed in this case, the rescuer, he was faced with a decision in the moment, one that the Monday morning quarterback isn't faced with. It's very easy to look back on a situation and say, well, we should do it better this way. We'd have better success that way. But of course, in the moment, you have a split-second choice. Should I jump back in and try to help someone, or should I worry more about myself? And it's true, of course, anytime you do something that is dangerous, you're potentially impacting people who aren't there, your family, your friends, and so on. But you're also potentially impacting the family, the friends, and so on of the people that you're trying to help. And so, as you say, there's a balance here, and it's hard to decide in that moment, what the balance sheet will look like at the end. What I'm so interested in, is how we, measure success, right? Here, in that example that you gave, the person fails because he dies. And obviously when you die, not only have you impacted your family and your friends and yourself, obviously negatively, you also haven't saved people, right? But I think, I wrote about this in the book that I just finished, and I think I'll probably continue to write about this. There are so many spectacular examples of people who fail. And in many of those cases, they can't help but fail. There is no way to succeed, right? But it's in the doing, it's in the trying that I think they achieve this heroism. My favorite example, and we can talk more about this in a minute if you like, is the example of Janusz Korczak, who is this orphanage director in occupied Poland during the Second World War, and he also happens to have some measure of fame as an author. And Korczak could have escaped the ghetto. He could even have escaped going to the concentration camps at a very late moment. It's very clear that he could get away, but he won't leave the children, right? And so there's no way to succeed there, right? The children die, and Korczak dies, but it's in doing what he does that he is heroic. There's always going to be a measure of failure, but he would have failed far, far worse if he had saved himself and abandoned the children.
Absolutely. There's no heroism in running away. Right. I think there's those two examples are different in that one is sacrifice. The one's knowing and willing sacrifice. And the other one is risk-based, where it might be the same result. The end result is death. But with the risk, it is unknown whether the death is coming. Or in the sacrifice, you've resigned yourself to dying in the heroic act. So that's interesting to me, and I get tongue-tied sometimes, I think, when I'm explaining heroism with that risk-sacrifice act, because ultimately risk is just the danger, just the chance of sacrifice, right? What I wanted to go back to was, what was I going to say? That a big concern about that story of the guy rescuing and then dying is that we put these heroes up there as examples, and a big role of the hero of claiming to people or attributing heroism to people is at the example that it sets us, whether it's one of these risk or sacrifice-based heroes, or whether it's an idol, someone who we look up to that inspires us. So that inspiration part is an essential part of the role that the hero plays in our society. So when we see a story like that where the guy dies, we have to say, well, is this an example we want to give people? And the reason I think that's important is that assessing the risk is an important part of the hero's job. This is an incredibly important part for me when I'm talking to kids, because I don't want to go into a school and tell 5th graders or 4th graders stories about people jumping in front of trains to save someone, because that's the example. So it's important that I really talk about assessing the risk. So, what are the potential outcomes here? And definitely it has to be a quick decision, but it is a very important part of risk, not just instantly reacting and jumping in. It's very hazy for me. I'm not sure that's what I wanted to get to, was that do we hold someone up who failed as an example for others? It can be a negative example, and maybe that's its role, saying this is why you should assess risk.
I think it offers us such a compelling, now maybe not for 5th graders, right? But I think it offers us such compelling stories. There are so many good examples that come up. I don't know why all the Nazi examples are coming to my mind right now, but what about the Stauffenberg plot, right? I mean, made into that really terrible Tom Cruise movie where everybody had a different accent. Again, risk assessment is important, obviously, but there's something heroic in trying to do the right thing. It doesn't work, right? But I mean, there's two ways to think about it, right? On the one hand, there's it's still the right thing, even though it fails. And on the other hand, or the same hand, I don't know which hand, what if it had, right? What if that had worked? The number of people whose lives would have been impacted is almost incalculable. So do we hold that up as an example? It's a failure. There are bad consequences for the actors who engage in that plot. But nonetheless, it's a very heroic thing to do. I was thinking, too, of this example. I can't remember his name. He was a running back, I think, for the Kansas City Chiefs many years ago, very highly regarded early on in his career. And there were 2 children drowning, or 3 children drowning as he walked by a pond or something where they were swimming. And he jumped in. He rescued one. Something along these lines, rescued 1, rescued 2, died in attempting to rescue the last child who was not rescued. Yeah. What do we say? Well, he got 1, so if he had known his limitations, he would have said, "Hey, I got 1," and then he and that 1 would have gone on. But I think I think you're right. These are challenging questions. In no small part because anytime someone does a risky thing, the potential for failure is obviously there, and it's huge, right? We're talking about spectacular failures that lead people to ultimately to their deaths when things don't go well. But so much of that is bound up with heroism for me, right? If we're not risking anything, then it's not particularly heroic. And even if we don't succeed, I think that there's something to be said there, right? At the very least, we can say, hey, certainly to 5th graders, hey, it's important to be careful. It's important not to recklessly endanger yourself, and so on. But the message is the same. It's the same with bullying. It's the same with with jumping into a pond. There's a right thing to do and a wrong thing to do, and we want to put ourselves on the right side. That's the heroic thing to do, and every heroic action. Look, combating bullying is dangerous work too, right? For 5th and 6th grade kids who stand up to another group of kids and say, hey, I don't think that's the way we should talk about this other person. There's a risk there, right? You could get beat up, or you can be socially ostracized. Which is perhaps worse than getting beat up. But do we say, well, in assessing the risk, be careful. You might want to step back from that and find some way around the bullying problem. I'm uncomfortable with that. I want to say, no, there's a right and a wrong thing, and even though there are consequences, and even though it's dangerous, we can still say here's a model of good behavior, proper behavior.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's the clear right thing to do. I just think that with the risk assessment, there are other options for doing the right thing. There are other ways to do it or other methods to do it. I wonder if the reason that Tom Cruise wasn't as famous as he could have been if he had killed Hitler, I think you hit on something there, that there's less fame involved. There's less of the story being retold if it was a failure. Definitely that it's an heroic attempt. Maybe that's the difference maker there, that the heroism is in the attempt, and then maybe the outcome is what makes it bona fide heroism. I'm not sure, but certainly I think the retelling of the story is a good indicator of heroism, because ultimately it's a title that society puts on people. Yeah, I'm not sure.
We can keep playing with this too. I don't think we need to find the answer today. I should note, though, in Germany, Stauffenberg is quite well known, right? Yeah. Perhaps not as well known here or anywhere else. But if you walk around Berlin, you'll find streets named for him and so on. It's not nothing, and it's true. I think that it would be more impressive, obviously, if it had come off well, but the prospect of that actually working was so small, right? And that's why, for me, it's so heroic, because if you actually sat down and thought about it, you would say, no, my best bet is either to just continue going along with things, being an officer in this army, or at the very least, I suppose, if I'm really concerned with doing the right thing, I can I can try to use my injury to stay home and not be involved, at least, in the armed forces. Right? Those were the other options that were available, but here's a person who says and is able to go with other people and get them all to say, this is a great wrong, and there needs to be something done about it. Maybe it's just rooting for underdogs or something that I have, or a sort of sentimentality or something. But I really, I think that there is really something to be gained from looking at these examples. Even with my students in college, right? And maybe this still speaks to your sacrifice point more than anything else. When we read the Iliad, everybody likes Hector. Yeah, but he can't win. And if he did a proper risk assessment, he should know all along that he can't win. The odds are terrible, but he goes out and he behaves heroically, and he does his best. And in failure, there's still something impressive in it.
I wonder if the difference is coming from the intent, maybe, or does the hero say, right, I'm probably going to die, but I'm going to do it anyway, compared with my impression of that, the guy jumping into the water, either of the guys we talked about, is not that they made that. I don't imagine that they said, right, I'm going to die, but I have to save these kids, right? I think there's a difference there that maybe is where I was coming from. There's maybe some psychology there that if someone has just said, right, I am now prepared to die, think about Braveheart, where William Wallace in the movie, I'm not going to get into the movie versus reality, but I've got a Scottish friend. He walks in knowing that he's going to die. He's given up, and there's a big difference there than if he had, raided somewhere but had not given. He knew that there was a risk of death, but had not said, right, I'm going to die, but I'm going to do this anyway. I think there's a big difference there.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we'll talk about this, I think, too. This is another great two-man pod that we can do at some point. I'm really interested in, I don't want to call it the heroics of death or something like that, but, there's a huge role in my book, played by this idea of our mortality, and the idea that when you give up all hope for continued existence, right, or for indefinite existence, that really opens up a space for heroic action, right? That it's some of it, of course, is split-second decision-making and so on, but some of the stuff that really requires plans, right, where you actually have to sit down and set up what you're going to do and how it's going to work and so on. When you really think about the stakes, these are people who have confronted their mortality in a way that not a lot of people do, right? And I think that what you see on the other side with collaborators, for example, these are people who will bargain away what they know to be the morally right thing for extra years of life, right? They'll say, it's really important to me. I've thought about it. I've actually thought about it. And if I make this deal, if I work with the Army, if I go along with what this government wants me to do and so on, I can continue living and probably more comfortably and so on. So I think that there is this real role that we should talk about at some point that death plays, right, or the prospect of death plays.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, ultimately, I think that the comment about success being a requirement comes from the failure when people aren't expecting to fail, I think, where it isn't a sacrifice, or it isn't an intended sacrifice. Because certainly some people that intend to die don't. So that I think it's in a different realm than, here's my plan, I'm going to do this, there's some risk, but failing in that risk.
Yeah, I think that's right? I mean, you have these people who say, I want to win, right? I want to do this, I want to help, I want to be successful, but I recognize that the odds are not great. Yeah, it's long odds. I'm putting myself in danger, I may be putting my family in danger, but to do otherwise would be to put myself in a sort of moral hazard, right? And so I can't do anything else, right? Even though the prospects for me are not good, I have to make this decision, and that may lead to my death. But perhaps in the interim, I can do the things that I want to do. And even if it comes off spectacularly badly, even if I don't accomplish anything that I set out to do, I'll still know that I did the right thing, which to me is the most important, right? I have these principles, this set of principles that I understand to be the defining principles for my life, and if I act differently, how will I live with myself? What would my life be like if I said, well, it's most important for me to simply live longer?
Right. I think the great example, or theoretical example, is the firefighter who has been told not to go back in because it's been deemed to be unsafe. Now, they have the choice: do they go in knowing that it's very dangerous and they're going against orders, and they have a perfectly good excuse to not go in? But then what happens if they do go in and they die and don't save anyone? Is that still heroic, or is it foolhardy when there's absolute failure? So we're not talking about someone jumping in and saving some people and not saving other people. We're talking about someone who has gone against advice and failed to do anything positive. What do you think about that kind of?
Well,
because you could say that if a rescuer has saved some people, that's success. But this is an abject failure. So is it still heroic to go in like that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I suppose I should go all in, right? Yeah, absolutely, right? Still heroic because there were people's lives on the line. There were people who could have been saved, and everyone else said, we'll have to, well, unfortunately, let them burn up. We've reached a point where we can't do any more. And here's a person who says, maybe we can do a bit more, right? And I don't know if we can, but I have to try. Because if I don't try, I will always wonder whether we could have done something to save those people, or whether we were just protecting ourselves, which to me feels bad, right? Feels impermissible. So I try, and if I succeed, obviously I'm a great hero. Right? I get the key to the city and everyone's unending gratitude, and maybe there's a Lifetime movie about me. But if I fail, people ought to say, here is someone who tried. Yeah? Knowing the risks and against advice, here is someone who tried, because the trying matters.
I find that fascinating, because my impression is that firefighters would be mad at that guy. And I think, these rules presumably exist, or these directions, this fire is gone, we can't save anyone, are there to save lives. They're there to save firefighter lives. And so both of us are encouraging generally heroic behavior. But what if every firefighter did what we just said? I mean, it's an interesting balance. It may be that we shouldn't have a world of heroes because we have declining population. It's very interesting, because I remember watching Rescue Me, the TV show, and there were the moments of heroism there, or foolhardiness, and people were not happy that someone was breaking the rules, and whether it was because they were being shown up or whether it was because they were worried about the person dying. It's an interesting balance. Maybe we just need a certain percentage of heroes for the world to be at a perfect place.
Yeah, and I think that there's something to be said for that, right? I mean, it's really difficult to imagine everyone who is a public hero, right? Maybe I want to talk about a difference at some point with you about the difference between a public hero and a private hero, right? We have plenty of space for everyone in the world to be privately heroic in their lives, right? You can treat your family properly. You can raise your children the right way. You can encourage greater respect and toleration. All those things I would think of maybe as being privately heroic. But I don't think we need hundreds of millions of people who will leap into rivers and burning buildings. We don't need everyone we meet to be a potential vigilante crime fighter. I think that this would be, I don't want to say catastrophic, but it would be, in some sense, it would be very difficult to live in a world like that. Not simply because you'd have so many people, throwing themselves into the hazard, but also because sometimes people are wrong, right? Sometimes people feel themselves be driven by a, moral code or principles or whatever, and they really need to think more critically about what it is that they're doing. But what we would, so what I want to say is private heroism, good for all. Public heroism, sometimes. And I think that it's in figuring out those times where I would need to spend another hour, at the very least, to try to sort out how that would work and how you encourage, on the one hand, this private heroism in our everyday lives, and on the other hand, those occasional bursts of public heroism when they're appropriate.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. So should we move on to another topic?
Let's do, because we found ourselves, just with a new conundrum.
Right. So I don't know, a year ago, maybe a bit more, Phil Zimbardo's Heroic Imagination Project was launched, and there are lots of facets to it, and one of them is a focus on health heroes. And, right away I sort of pushed that aside as not something that was heroic, that there wasn't really a whole lot of potential for heroism there. And the examples were, I think the prime example was of a kid stopping his parents from smoking. And I didn't give it much thought. But then yesterday, when Whitney Houston died, and I knew we were having our show today, I thought about that, because here is someone who has spent 20 years being essentially addicted to drugs of all sorts, and has lots of people around her, because she's famous, who could have risked losing her as a friend or an associate by just standing up and saying something about it. And I'm now retroactively regretting dismissing the health heroes, because I think there is a risk in standing up to someone who you love. There's some reciprocal love there, that you're going to lose it. I don't think necessarily getting your dad to take his vitamins is heroic, but when it's a life and death situation, or potentially life and death situation, and there is a real social risk in standing up, particularly when there's a lot of people reinforcing the behavior, that there's some heroism in there. And maybe Whitney Houston suffered because no one was willing to be heroic around her.
Well, let me begin by first taking this opportunity to identify myself as a health hero. The word on the street, I don't have any memory of this, but apparently I was responsible as a young child for my mother's cessation of smoking. Thank you to Phil Zimbardo for allowing me to stand up today and identify as a health hero. I don't remember what I did, but apparently I was just so darling and so earnest that she could not continue to smoke while her young child was upset by it. Maybe I'll bring her on the Hero Report and she can tell the story someday. I'm sure she would love that. But I think you raise. I think this is another good example of actually the private heroism that I was talking about. So many of these things would be cases where it's a one-on-one situation where the risk is not necessarily immediate, but where you could do long-term damage to a friendship or relationship or whatever, but where not doing it really does put the person in, keep the person in harm's way. And as we see, the long-term consequences of substance abuse or smoking or whatever, eating McDonald's. I mean, we could come up with all sorts of examples that I'm sure will mean we won't get sponsorship of the Hero Report from those businesses. But the long-term consequences, we see them. People die of these things. So is it heroic to step in and say, look, we have to get you help, we have to do this and that? Absolutely, I think it is. I don't know I have to be honest, I don't know the particulars of Whitney Houston's situation well enough to know whether anyone did that for her or not, or attempted to do that for her or not. I suspect that, in the coming weeks and months, as the tabloids, sort of ratchet up their Whitney Houston coverage to sell more magazines at the grocery checkout, we'll probably hear some of these stories, actually. I'm sure someone like Whitney's ex-publicist comes forward, or, whatever. Whitney's former boyfriend or boyfriend's sibling. I mean, someone, said to her, you have to go into treatment, you need help. And whether those stories are true or not, we see they didn't have the desired effect, obviously, but it does take some measure of courage to say to someone that you care about, and in many cases that we're talking about here, someone who has some power in the relationship, whether it's a parent or someone who's rich and famous, to say to such a person, you're doing some real harm to yourself, and I can't stand by and watch it.
Yeah, I think that mention of the power just there is an important part that would be essential in the heroism, because I'm not sure that it's as heroic for a parent to correct a kid smoking, right? Because there's not that that's expected from the parent.
That's duty.
Yeah, right. And yeah, I think these people that are wildly famous and rich, there's a lot of different pressures in there. I think we probably saw, I mean, not saw, the similar thing happened with Michael Jackson, that there were hundreds of hangers-on that were just, it was not in their best interest to upset the person who was providing them with their lifestyle. But I think I wonder if our listeners and viewers would share with us examples or stories, because I think there's a lot of people who have someone in their family that is addicted to prescription painkillers or illegal drugs, or is obese, or any number of things. I wonder if anyone's had any experience in trying that and succeeded or failed, and where it went from then.
Yeah,
where it went from there.
That's a great question. It was funny that when you started talking about it, what I thought of was not this past season, the final season, but the season before of Entourage. I don't know if you ever watched Entourage, but one of the central plot point of that season was that the rich and famous Hollywood star gets involved with all sorts of hard drugs, whereas in all the previous seasons he was very involved in not so hard drugs. And his friends have to sort of figure out how to interact with him and with this problem. So it is a really good question for people, because the pervasiveness of addiction is something that we're all struggling with in this society. Whether it's substances, whether it's who knows, gambling. I mean, there's all sorts of things that people are doing that impact their lives really negatively, and that they need help. They can't necessarily stop themselves, and that does open up a space for this sort of privately heroic behavior.
Right. I think there was. We should have an episode of The Wire too. I think there's a lot of things to relate to in our conversation today, just in the failure of attempted heroism, and we'll talk about The Wire another time.
That would be great.
The other thing that I wanted to talk about was Chris Brown. That's his name, right?
Yeah.
And I said earlier that I'm not a fan of commercial music these days.
You've edited yourself nicely for this episode.
I said earlier that I was not a fan of modern music, which is not the truth.
And then he waved his walking stick around and put on his top hat and walked away.
What I meant was basically that I would not ever imagine watching the Grammys, but because we're in the world of Facebook, I knew that it was on last night.
Yes.
And so, we had the Whitney Houston piece there, but also Chris Brown apparently won an award of some sort after being convicted of or admitting to domestic violence, and has got wild adulation, and there were all sorts of responses on Twitter that had been collected on a page I saw today of girls saying Chris Brown can hit me as much as he wants as long as he takes me, or variations on that. And I just wonder if there was an opportunity there too, and not necessarily last night, but any time over the last couple of years since the incident came out, that there are people in the music industry who are famous who could spread the word, could stand up and say this is wrong. And I wonder, maybe again, our viewers who are not haters of modern music can share with us any incidents that did happen. But I wonder, obviously, again, there's pressure to not do that. There's pressure to conform. There's pressure to be part of the Grammys machine so that potentially you can win an award in the future, to not upset the apple cart. So I wanted to throw that out there as well as another opportunity for potential heroism, and I know you've got some thoughts too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. That's the first thing I should say. I think there is, anytime you have someone who's so in the public eye, as they both were in this relationship, right? And the incident, the domestic violence incident, was so public. There's obviously there's been a lot said about it. There's been a lot of reaction to it, and it's good. It would be good, I think, to collect in some way the people whose responses we think actually hit the mark, right? Who said, I'm going to take this opportunity to register that this is a problem and that one's fame, one's good voice, one's talent doesn't excuse this terrible behavior, right? That I think there's plenty of space for people to do, and I think that would be a good project, actually. Now, here's the part where I say maybe the unpopular thing. I wonder about sort of the statute of limitations. In other words, it is undeniably true. We all know it to be the case that this person behaved reprehensibly, that he committed a crime, and then the question is, for how long do we associate this person with that behavior? Maybe it's forever. I don't know. But I wonder if we want to be in a position of saying, here is an award show that celebrates someone's talent, but we won't recognize this person's talent because of the terrible things that this person did some years ago. That might be, right? Yeah, I'm okay with it. I guess I have to think more about this, right? If it turned out that some war criminal was also a fantastic figure skater, I think I would probably say, well, being a war criminal precludes you from being entered into the Figure Skating Hall of Fame. So maybe it's the same thing here. Maybe I don't want to draw that line, but I do want to ask that question, right? I think you're right that people should say, here's a person who did a bad thing. But I'm always hesitant when people then want to say, at least to some extent, make the claim, this is a bad person. Right? And I think that the longer we associate, the longer we say award shows shouldn't invite such a person, it's impermissible to give him an award because of the thing that he did, I think we get closer and closer to associating the person with the act and saying, this is an abuser. Right? Now, again, I don't know Chris Brown. He may actually be an abuser, in which case this is something we should say, right? Here is someone who won't stop doing these terrible things, right? It is part of who he is. But it also might not be.
Yeah, I think there's two parts that are, or there's one piece of information that I think is important in making that judgment is whether an apology was granted or made or an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. So I think there's that.
And it should be continued contrition, right? I mean, yeah. I think that there's so much public apology these days where people say, "Oh, I'm sorry it bothered you. I'm sorry you were offended. I'm sorry you heard about it." Right? Those sorts of like faux apologies that get us through to the next day when something else happens in the news. But with a situation like this, I think it's really important for someone to say, this was a wrong. I was in the wrong in this case, and in fact, in all of my dealings in this relationship, I was likely in the wrong. I hope in the future to have positive, productive relationships. I'm working very diligently to make sure that's the case and to never backslide into this kind of behavior again. This is something he should go to events about domestic violence and abuse. He should be speaking. I mean, I don't know if we see that from him. I don't have the sense that we do, but someone could obviously correct me. And in the absence of that, I think you're right. Right, there is a problem where it's someone who wanted that incident to go away so that he could get on with his career and the adulation of fans and so on.
Right, and I think. I don't think it's the Grammys' role to police that. I think the Grammys should be acknowledging talent, but I think there's a role for another entertainer to remind people, because I don't think Chris Brown is doing it, that domestic violence is wrong, and I think there's a there's a platform there, and I think you were right on with the action versus the person. I deal with that with bullying a lot, and in the last couple of weeks, I've made given a couple of talks on the subject. And one of the biggest problems with anti-bullying programs and using the word bullying is the labeling, because that doesn't go away. that's something that can continue with a kid all through school. And I know there's I know of a boy in a kindergarten class right now who is exhibiting bullying behaviors and is being labeled as a bully, but 6 months into his school life and is almost certainly still experimenting with how to interact with people. But because parents are upset, they then report to the school. The school has to do something because they've been backed into a corner where they have to have a zero tolerance policy on bullying, and so they have to do something, and so now this kid is a bully according to his teachers, the parents of his classmates, and his classmates, and he's going to carry that through. It's going to be very difficult for him to break out of that label. He doesn't, he's not going to sell 1 million records and have people saying, yeah, hit me as much as you want. I think labeling, I think that's a really important piece to remember, for sure.
Well, Matt, what should we say? I think we've gone on for quite some time, much longer than perhaps we anticipated with just a two-man podcast. But I think it was a really good conversation. It was quite helpful for me in setting out some of the terms that we talk about with some regularity, like risk and sacrifice and the role they play in heroism. I think it was also nice we should do this more often, just sort of the two-person getting down to the real business of what we mean when we talk about some of these issues and topics. And of course, it's always nice to pull in Whitney Houston, Chris Brown. We almost pulled in The Wire, but we'll do that soon. I think an all-TV episode of the Hero Report will be forthcoming. I think that would be a lot of fun.
Absolutely, absolutely. And hopefully, at the end of the week, we're going to get off our typical definitions of heroic behavior and talk to someone who is trying to live the life of a hero very deliberately. So we'll cross our fingers that he's going to be available on Friday, and I think that's probably enough for us.
Very well. Thank you, Matt. It was good to see you, and we'll talk again later on.
All right. Thank you, Ari.
Okay. Take care.